What's up guys, it's Annie and I just arrived in Taiwan from the United States amidst this whole coronavirus situation. So a lot of people have been asking me to make these videos because they kind of want to see what the situation is like here, either because they're just curious how Taiwan handled COVID or because they are actually trying to travel here as well and they kind of want to have an idea of the arrival process and how quarantine works. So I'll just give you a quick overview of my personal experience, which could possibly be totally different from other people. This is an evolving situation, so I'm sure that there will be new rules and regulations that will adapt over time. Okay, so first of all, why this mandatory quarantine? So the Taiwan government actually implemented this quarantine months ago when the pandemic first started, and they were able to manage the virus so well that other countries started to look at Taiwan and learn from them to implement quarantine as well. And of course, we hear about Taiwan on the news all the time saying oh, they did such a good job handling the pandemic, they never had to go into lockdown, etc. And it kind of annoys me when I hear people who are like, well, Taiwan never went into lockdown, why do we have to go into lockdown? And Taiwan is doing just fine, I'm sure we'll be fine. And I'm like, no, that's not how it works. You don't know the whole logistics side of things and what it took for the Taiwan government to all come together and evaluate the situation and get a grip on how to manage it. And I'm like, anti-maskers can't even wear a piece of cloth over their mouth when they're literally allowed to go outside and run errands. How do you think they're going to feel about a mandatory 14-day isolation mandated by the government who tracks your every move? That's the thing about Taiwanese people though. Not only do people not complain about being locked up for 14 days with no contact with the outside world, they're actually willing and wanting to do this because they know how much the Taiwanese government cares for its people and they don't want to be that person who gets the virus and possibly infects other people. To this day, Taiwan only has 7 COVID-related deaths. So with such a few number, everybody knows, what the names of these people are and what happened to them. And nowadays, even if you just test positive, that is one additional case for the entire country and you'll be in the news and everyone in the whole world will know who you are, where you came from, what you do, your travel history, everything. So people just really want to stay safe and healthy. And after 2 weeks, you're free to go about your normal life as usual. So nothing to complain about here. Okay, so who has to go under this quarantine? So actually everyone who comes into Taiwan has to go under 14-day quarantine, whether you're a Taiwanese citizen or a foreigner, whatever, everyone has to go through it. And this doesn't mean you have the virus or came into contact with someone who did. Actually, you have to fill out a form before you even get your boarding pass stating that you feel healthy and you don't have any symptoms. And on top of that, they also take your temperature before you get your boarding pass just so you're cleared to fly. So quarantine is actually just a preventative measure to protect all the people who are already in the country in case you caught something traveling from a different country, or if you're just traveling from a country that has a high number of cases. It's basically just to minimize the chance of a outbreak. So quarantine here is complete isolation. It's not even considered social distancing anymore because there's literally no one to social distance from. You're by yourself alone in your room at all times. Literally the person that delivers the food to my room 3 times a day, they ring the doorbell and then run away. My door is only a couple steps away and by the time I open the door, that person is gone. I can look down the hallway and there's no sign of them whatsoever. So yeah, the government takes this quarantine very seriously. There are hefty fines. For example, there's a bunch of forms that you need to fill out. Also, they give everyone a thermometer and it's required for you to take your temperature twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening. And all these forms and temperature taking, whatever, if you falsify any of this information, there's a fine for that, as well as if you break quarantine for any reason, even just for a second, you will get fined upwards to 1 million new Taiwan dollars, which is 35,000 US dollars. And the government does use contact tracing to track you via the GPS on your phone. And if you are feeling sick at any time during the day, there is a designated number where you can call and someone will come pick you up and take you to the hospital. When you land at the airport, they specifically tell you if you're not feeling well, don't seek medical attention on your own because they don't want you to accidentally come in contact with anyone. They don't want you breaking quarantine, especially if you're not feeling well. So you call this number and someone will come and pick you up. They know a lot of foreigners might be afraid of emergency services because they might used to an ambulance ride being hundreds of dollars that they can't pay for or that their insurance doesn't cover. But the Taiwanese government has actually price controlled everything in relation to the quarantine situation. And they've also subsidized many services that might be needed. So all in all, you'll probably pay less than $100 for everything. I know people that have paid $20 or $40 for the ambulance ride, all the tests they had to take at the hospital. Some even had an overnight stay. Even if they didn't have coronavirus and they just needed to be monitored, the government just wants to make sure that there's no chance of spreading the virus to its people. And that's why they take this quarantine very seriously. And they just want to make sure that you accurately document your temperature and your symptoms every day. They just don't want you to be pressured into lying about your symptoms in fear of racking up a huge medical bill in a foreign country. So make sure you just follow the rules and everything will be fine. fine. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about when you're done with this whole quarantine. So timing. So how many days exactly? I know a lot of people say like 14 days, or they start their count at like day 0. You hear 14 plus 1, 15, 16, whatever. So the official length of mandatory quarantine is 14 days. I know there are some people who have special permits or visas or requirements where they could apply for like a shortened period of time for specific needs or reasons. For a majority of the people, it is the full 14-day quarantine. So that is midnight to midnight, 24 hours, 14 days. So the clock starts at midnight, which means the day you land / check into your hotel, that doesn't count. So if you land at like 4 or 5 in the morning, which is actually what most flights are like, for example, like mine was like that, you're out of luck because you've already missed that midnight mark. So your 14-day count doesn't start until it hits midnight, which is almost a full day later. So actually, technically, I guess you're quarantined for 15 days. But if your flight lands later at night, like 10 or 11 p.m., then you're in luck because since the clock starts at midnight, basically after you land, your quarantine starts and you save a couple hours of quarantine, I guess. So if you're staying at a hotel, obviously your check-in day is your landing day, which unfortunately doesn't count towards the 14 days. And then the day you check out is obviously after midnight on the last day at like 11 a.m. or something. So actually, technically, they book you for 15 nights. So it's 14 days of quarantine plus check-in and check-out. So that's actually 16 days. And technically, you are allowed to go out once the clock strikes midnight on the last day. But for me personally, my hotel's a little bit far from downtown, so I'll probably just stay in the room until checkout time the next morning. Maybe I'll go outside and walk around just because I can. Maybe look for like boba or something, or go to a night market nearby. But I doubt anything around here will be open after midnight. I know there's a lot more like hotel details and like questions that people have about hotel requirements and booking and all that. So I'll probably make like a separate video just to address those, just because there's so many more and I don't want this video to be like super long. So all in all, the official government quarantine is 14 days, 14 24-hour cycles from midnight to midnight. That's when the government will track you and your location. And then after that, there's actually an additional 7 days of like self-health management, where basically you still have to like take into account your temperature and your symptoms and everything. But you are allowed to go home and you're allowed to like go out if you really need to, and you're not tracked by the government anymore. But if you do end up feeling symptoms after you're out of quarantine, then you still need to contact the government and tell them that you're not feeling well, so they can make sure to take the proper measures. So the reason why it's this 14 plus 7 days is because actually the incubation period for coronavirus is like 22 days. So that would give you like 21 days plus some. It's basically just a precaution. I can't imagine having mandatory quarantine for 22 days. That's kind of crazy. I think the government really did a great job in doing the whole like 14-day mandatory quarantine plus 7 days of self-health management afterwards. Okay, so now I'll talk about my flight specifically. To be honest, I was kind of nervous to fly during this whole like pandemic, especially when you see on the news, like for example, a flight attendant could have gotten the virus from one of the passengers, and then that flight attendant who was serving all the other passengers might have spread it to everyone else on the plane. But now Taiwan specifically has done a really good job controlling the spread of the virus. And I know their airlines have implemented a bunch of new measures to ensure the safety of their own cabin crew as well as their passengers. So obviously there's still a risk, and we still need to take precautions to make sure we're doing our part to stay as safe as possible as well. For example, on the flight, it's actually mandatory for everyone to wear a mask at all times throughout the entire duration of the flight. The only exception is for meal times, but actually a lot of passengers opt out of meals because they don't want to take off their mask at all, so they just don't eat or drink for the entire duration of the flight. And also they don't want to like drink any liquids because they don't want to have to use the restroom during the flight, which is where, you know, cross-contamination could occur because there are other passengers that are sharing the same space. I heard that the flight attendants do disinfect the bathroom very, very often during the duration of the flight. Anyways, I personally did choose to eat the meals, and I tried my best not to use the restroom, but alas, I had to after each meal, so I used the restroom twice. And everyone's just trying their best to stay as safe as possible, so that really helps. Okay, so speaking of the mask requirement, so that's just the basic requirement for the flight, but actually most people were wearing a lot of other protective gear. For example, I saw things ranging from like face shields to shower caps, gloves, goggles. I personally was wearing a shower cap, glasses, mask, and gloves, but obviously like the glasses are exposed on the sides and it's not like a goggle where it's completely sealed. And I thought I did pretty good, but everyone else was wearing like a face shield and like whole hazmat suit and everything. So anyways, I tried my best. I think I might make a separate video on the protective gear for the flight specifically, just because a lot of people were asking me about that and kind of what other people are doing and how comfortable I was like being on a plane.